About Dorothea Lange, I have always had to begin by showing this photograph because I've learned that so many people do not know her name, but everyone knows this photograph. So people have called it the most famous photograph in America. The reason her name is so often unknown is that her best known work was done for the federal government and was published anonymously. I hope that that anonymity will end pretty soon. As a photographer identified above all with images of the Great Depression of the 1930s, her relevance today could hardly be greater. But I want to emphasize a larger span of her work and its larger significance. I think of Lange's photographic perspective as visual democracy. I believe she was attempting to make the democratic possibilities of this country visual as a way of promoting those possibilities. And she was confronting some of the same obstacles to democracy that remain today, as well as the challenges of making art relevant to that aspiration without losing its artistic integrity or artistic reach. But first, let me situate Lange as a person, just very briefly. She was a middle-class child of German Lutheran extraction, born in 1895, growing up in Hoboken, New Jersey. She had a very placid, happy childhood until two traumas hit her. The first was polio when she was 7 years old. She was left with a withered lower leg and a disfigured foot. Her mother was very concerned that she would be stigmatized by this disability and become unmarriageable. So her mother emphasized that Dorothea should disguise her disability as much as possible, and she did this very effectively. I had the experience of talking to some people who met her who did not know that she was disabled. When skirts got shorter, she started to wear slacks, quite unusual for the time, and she never again wore any skirt that was shorter than full length. Second trauma, when she was 12, her father left. This was very hard on her. She was very close to her father. Her mother presented this marital separation as a desertion, partly because that's how marital separation was understood at the time. Although, in fact, I found out it was more like a consensual separation. But Dorothea felt abandoned. She developed such a rage against her father that when she arrived in San Francisco at age 23, where she spent the rest of her life, she adopted her mother's maiden name, and she never mentioned her father again or his name to anyone, including her two husbands, her two children, her four stepchildren, her best friends. Dorothea was clearly born with an assertive temperament. Another girl might have been weakened by these similar experiences, but Dorothea only grew tougher and more independent. From age 12, she developed the practice of wandering alone the streets of New York. First the Lower East Side, where she attended middle school, then the Upper West Side, where she attended high school, and ultimately the entire island of Manhattan. This was behavior most unusual in a girl child, not entirely respectable or entirely safe, and yet this same mother who had urged her to disguise her limp did nothing to discourage this behavior. This teenage walker in the city was also an autodidact, a self-taught person. She was a mediocre student. She did not go to college, but she discovered on her own the modernist art that was blossoming in New York at the time. She taught herself photography by taking jobs as photographic assistant in several of the city's portrait studios. It was characteristic of Dorothea that she got one job by simply walking up to the shop of the nation's most illustrious portrait photographer, Arnold Genthy, and asking for a job. He thought she was talented, and he gave her a cast-off camera. It was actually the first time she'd had a camera of her own. She moved to San Francisco in 1918, and she soon opened a photography studio at an upscale location perfectly chosen next to an Elizabeth Arden salon and a fine art gallery. Within 2 years, she had become the portrait photographer for San Francisco's wealthy arts patrons. This high-velocity success derived from the conjunction of a very charismatic personality and a kind of modernist visual sophistication. At first, she used the romantic, misty, pictorial mode that dominated in the 1920s. Like this portrait. This is a portrait of a member of the Levi Strauss family. It's just among the great families of San Francisco who were her clients. But soon, she began to modernize her pictorialist conventions. She attracted elite arty clients with a bohemian elegance in her personal style, her studio's decor, and her photographs. She didn't use painted backgrounds, which were still very common in those days. She discouraged formal poses. She did not ask her subjects to smile, and she preferred them to wear old clothes because she thought they would be more relaxed. She used dramatic shadows and unusual angles and created emotion and sometimes mystery by hiding part of her subject. It's also a very typical move of Lange in this picture on the upper right, that she was hired by the family to photograph all the children, and one of them was a very moody, sulky teenage girl. And rather than wheedling her and trying to get her to smile, she photographed her just in that way. The elite reputation and clientele of Lange's business derived from her sensitivity to the class taste of her clients. Her work represented in many ways the acme of individualism in portraiture. She used what she had learned from Arnold Genthy to suggest, or to reveal, as she would put it, individuality and a deep inner life. She endowed her subjects with interiority. Her clients believed in her power to capture their essences. They felt that she could make their education, their culture, and their sensitivity shine out from these images. Gender also mattered a great deal in this success. Her clients, both male and female, believed that women had a more powerful ability to penetrate beneath the surface and perceive the core of each person's individuality. As she had begun to do in New York, in San Francisco, Lange integrated herself into a bohemian arts crowd and made her photography studio into a meeting place of artists and the more liberal wing of the city's arts patrons. In 1920, a year and a half after she arrived here, she married the city's most desirable bachelor artist, the painter Maynard Dixon. This is him on the left. Always dressed in black with cowboy boots and hat, he cut a dashing and magnetic figure at the center of a bohemian crowd of artists. This small, limping, photographic businesswoman had hooked the sexiest man in San Francisco. Throughout her life, Dixon was far more famous than she was. She adored him, but it was not an easy marriage. She was not only the exclusive housekeeper and parent, she not only put up with his womanizing and months-long absence on painting trips, but she was the main breadwinner for the family. When the Depression hit in the 1930s, while the streets of San Francisco were teeming with the hungry, the homeless, and the angry, her portrait studio began to seem confining. She took her heavy camera out into the city to photograph the men sleeping on park benches, the crowds lining up at relief stations or at soup kitchens like this, the demonstrations and the pitched battle with police. These were somber, pessimistic photographs, but nevertheless, to her surprise, she found herself more energetic and even happier as a street photographer. It was a slow start. She was accustomed only to work for hire. And at first, she worried about invading the privacy of street people or evoking their hostility. She was gratified that often they did not seem to notice her. Later, she would understand that she had developed a method for making people not notice her. She said, and I quote,